Good evening. My name is Dawn Tyler Lee, and I serve as the Deputy Chief of Staff of External Affairs for Mayor Ginther. I was raised in Columbus and am a proud Columbus City Schools graduate, and it is for these reasons that I am honored to also serve as chair of the search for our next police chief for the Columbus Division of Police. Thank you to each of you who have joined us here tonight at the historic East High School, and also for those of you who are watching us live on Facebook. Thank you to Principal Richardson and his team here at East for hosting us and for their hospitality. I would also like to reintroduce to some and thank the members of the search committee who have contributed countless hours to helping shape this important process. I will call them by name and ask that they stand. Franklin County Sheriff Dallas Baldwin, a retired lieutenant from the Columbus Division of Police. Siobhan Boyd Nelson, Development Director for Equality Ohio. Dee Debenport, Marion Village Block Watch Coordinator on the South Side. Stephanie Hightower, President and CEO of the Columbus Urban League. Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Key, Pastor of New Faith Baptist Church of Christ on the Near East Side. Kenny Ramos, retired sergeant in the Columbus Division of Police. Pastor Brian Williams, founder and leader of the Hope City House of Prayer in the Hilltop. And our ex officio members, Columbus City Council member and Safety Chair Mitch Brown, and Director of the Department of Public Safety, Ned Pettis. These community leaders have deep roots in our city, and I am grateful for the diverse perspectives, experiences, and backgrounds they have contributed to the search process. There is one other special group I would like to acknowledge. If you are 21 or younger, will you please stand? 21 and younger. Please remain standing, young people. 21 by your birth certificate, not by how you feel. 21. It was important to me that young people be part of this process, so we extended some special invitations to tonight's forums. We have young people from Columbus City Schools, Columbus Recreation and Parks, and Beatty Recreation Center in particular, the Columbus Urban League, Community for New Direction, the National Center for Urban Solutions, just to name a few. Thank you to their program leaders who helped ensure they could attend, and please join me in acknowledging the presence of these leaders and their demonstrated commitment to civic engagement. Our future is bright. Before we hear from our two final candidates, let me recap how we got to where we are today. In January, Mayor Ginther announced his plans to conduct a national search. As many of you know, this is the first time the city of Columbus has been able to search outside of the division. In April, the search committee was named and we outlined the search process and timeline. The mayor committed that the process would be thorough, open, transparent, and comprehensive. At that press conference, he stated what he was seeking in the next police chief, and I quote, "I am looking for a change agent who will pursue innovation and excellence in policing, someone who will use the recommendations of the Resident-Led Safety Advisory Commission as a roadmap to guide the division. I am looking for someone committed to increasing diversity among police officers, aligning how we police with community expectations, and approaching this position as an opportunity to serve and protect every person in every neighborhood." Shortly after being named, the search committee selected the Saunders Company to lead the community engagement component of the search, and the Chief and Me campaign was launched. Throughout May and June, we engaged a variety of people in a variety of ways to learn what you wanted to see in our next police chief. We attended summer festivals, conducted focus groups, community forums, and distributed surveys. We also went to early morning, mid-shift, and late evening roll calls at different police precincts throughout the city to encourage officers to also share what they would like to see in their next leader. By show of hands, how many of you participated in the surveys? Awesome, thank you. I am pleased to share with you that over 4,000 surveys were completed. You can see the complete report prepared by the Saunders Company at columbus.gov/police chief search, but the themes were very clear. You said you wanted a chief who is fair, honest, open, transparent, accountable, leads with integrity, can lead in a time of crisis, and is committed to work across all communities. A chief who supports training in de-escalation techniques, community policing, and cultural competence. Next, we released an RFP for a search firm seeking one with expertise in recruiting candidates for chiefs of police. The firm of Ralph Anderson was hired, and Robert Berg, Executive Vice President, became our project manager. In August, Robert spent a very full 2 days on the ground here in Columbus, meeting with a variety of stakeholders, including the search committee, the mayor, the safety director, city council, restored citizens, those experiencing homelessness, faith, business, and community leaders, safety and security partners from Columbus City Schools and the Columbus Metropolitan Libraries, the NAACP, the FOP, representatives from the immigrant and LGBTQ communities, and police chiefs from our neighboring jurisdiction. Did I say it was a full 2 days? And it was from all of this feedback, the surveys, community meetings, and stakeholder conversations that helped shape the job description and inform the types of candidates the search firm recruited both locally and nationally. 36 candidates applied by our October 14th deadline. The search committee reviewed their credentials and selected 5 to bring for in-person interviews, which occurred November 6th and 7th. Mayor Ginther said from the beginning that community engagement would be a cornerstone of this process, including an opportunity to meet and give feedback on final candidates before he makes a final decision. And that is what brings us to tonight and our 2 final candidates, Mr. Tom Quinlan and Mr. Perry Tarrant. Let me share with you the format for this evening. Each candidate has been allotted 10 minutes for an opening statement. They have been asked to introduce themselves, share their background, and present their specific plan of action if they are selected as the 34th police chief for the Columbus Division of Police. Following their opening statements, we will move into questions and answers. We will start with those that were submitted online over the past week, and these questions have not been shared with our candidates in advance. Over 100 questions were submitted, and we will ask as many as time will allow. In addition, there are question forms here this evening. Volunteers are available to collect any additional questions you might have. Following the question and answer, each candidate will have 2 minutes to make a closing statement. And let's begin. We flipped a coin, and Mr. Tarrant will be the first to make our opening statement. Mr. Tarrant?
Good evening, Columbus. Okay, I can see more people out there than what that sounded like. Let's try that one more time. Good evening, Columbus. There we go. Thank you very much. First, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the trooper that was struck earlier this morning and just identify how difficult of a job policing is. The second thing I want to say about that is when you're out driving, please be alert. I want to start off by thanking Mayor Ginther and the selection committee for the opportunity to speak to the community. Thank you, community, for expressing your voice in this process to define the city of Columbus. I have received overwhelming calls, messages, positive thoughts, and well wishes from Columbus. I am humbled and honored to be here before you. Again, I just want to say thank you. Your voice is critical and important to change. It's important to changing systems and practices. The community foundation of policing was shaped by Sir Robert Peel, one of his 9 principles of service to community. The police are the public, and the public are the police. That is a principle and a guide-on that has stuck with me from the early part of my law enforcement career. And I'll give you a little bit more about my background momentarily. Your voice is important in how this community will evolve in the future, how this organization will evolve in the future. While we've never forgotten our history, change is inevitable. We must change. Historically and traditionally, law enforcement has failed to keep up with the evolution of our communities. It has lagged behind. So let's talk about culture and community for a moment. When we talk about community, when we talk about culture, the one thing that is consistent across all cultures is respect. The second thing that is common across all communities is humility. I'm humbled to be here before you today and have this opportunity to speak with you. The responsibility that comes with authority is respect. It is the obligation of those in authority to respect the people who they police. The principles behind that are founded and grounded in the U.S. Constitution. During my law enforcement career, I've been given 4 copies of the Constitution. The first one I received when I completed training in the state of Arizona and was certified. The second one I received when I completed and was certified in the state of Washington, working for the Seattle Police Department. I received another copy from a person who identified themselves as being extremely on the right. And the fourth one came from a group of folks who described themselves as being on the extreme left. I read intentionally each one of those copies of the Constitution, and guess what? They're all the same. There's only one Constitution, but it is certainly open to interpretation. There are differences in perspectives of what that looks like. I'm going to go back to the same theme. Your voice is important. How things get done in any community is by whose voices are heard. It is my job to give voice to the community. A little bit about my background. I have always believed in community service. I've been a part of every community that I've lived in, every community that I've worked in. And when I say been a part, I'm talking in terms of community service. And I think that is the key to not only the organization itself, but into building community. So let's talk about community policing. Community policing is just not a thing that a police department does. It is in everything a police department does and has to be in everything a police department does. The desired state of policing. We, as a community, have a desire to be secure in our homes and things. We are all responsible for each other's safety. So how do we do that? We do that through inclusion, transparency, and accountability. So my plan is to create a police department or police division advisory committee, where the value comes from in creating that community or that committee is a version of oversight. What I've learned in my experience working with several different police departments, law enforcement organizations, is that when you involve the community in developing rules, regulations, and policies, it's clear to the community what the expectations are. It's clear to the folks internal to the organization what the expectations are. And it becomes your metric to hold people accountable. This will not be the last time you see me, this town hall. It is my responsibility and my expectation to be in front of the community on a regular basis. That's just in my nature and how I've always engaged communities while policing. One of the ways of doing that is not to invite you here, but for me to come to where you are, to me to come into your communities. One of the programs that we put in place were public safety walks. That's where we collaborate with other city departments and walk through neighborhoods a few blocks at a time to have personal conversations and resolve issues which may not be police issues. I also want to make sure, in the vein of inclusion, transparency, and accountability, that we have available open data. And when I say open data, what I'm saying is data that's collected by the organization will be outward-facing, so it can be seen by all. There are benefits to that. The benefits to that is it sparks innovation from the community and builds upon those relationships. I spoke of partnerships, and I want to connect that to diversity. One of the ways to build diversity into the organization is through partnerships. There are a number of organizations that have workforce programs. The Urban League has a young professional program, and I particularly want to identify the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives and asked Mr. Dwayne Crawford, the Executive Director of Noble, to please stand. Thank you. Thank you. I'm proud to be a member of that organization. I'm proud to have been its past national president. And the reason why I say that is that organization has reached out and touched over 60,000 youth through its outreach programs. More importantly, thank you. More importantly, they have charged themselves and set a goal for themselves to mentor and identify 1,000 potential law enforcement candidates, minority candidates, in the very near future. So I got the card there, and I want to ask a real quick question. So this is the audience participation part of my remarks. How many of you want diversity in the police division? Raise your hands, show of hands. Okay. How many of you want to become cops? Ooh, okay. Okay, ooh. It's a pretty tough job, and I do admit that. But if you want diversity in the police division, I'm going to ask you, well, let me just phrase it as a question because I'm kind of curious now where you're sitting on this. How many of you are willing to help me diversify the organization? Show of hands. Okay, that's where we're going here. I want to close out by saying and briefly telling you how I got into law enforcement. I started my law enforcement career after being stopped by the police. It did not go well, and so I had two options. One was to complain and let that be my solution, resolution, and trauma, or two was work on changing the organization. That's how I started in policing. You change organizations by pressure from the outside and pressure from the inside, and that's how you change an organization. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for the card. I'm going to go sit down.
Thank you, Mr. Tarrant. And now we will hear from Interim Chief Tom Quinlan.
Thank you and good evening. So I'd like to begin by thanking the community, you who showed up to participate in this process and help us select the next police chief for Columbus. I'd also like to thank Dawn Tyler Lee for her leadership in bringing us to this point in the selection process. And thank you. And the East High School principal, Mr. Richardson, for opening his doors to us. Very kind. And finally, on behalf of the men and women of the Division of Police, it's an honor for me to extend a welcome to Assistant Chief Perry Tarrant for being here tonight. Welcome. So I've had the good fortune over many years to have mentors that really had an impact on how I developed as a police officer. And one of the most recent people that I have mentored under is Commissioner Charles Ramsey. He's the architect of the 6 pillars of 21st century policing. And all of us who he mentors, there's many, and those of us he mentors, he asks a simple question to. He asks, do you want the job or do you want to do the job? I'm going to answer that question for you here in a moment. But I'd first like to give you a little bit of background about myself and my family. I've served the city of Columbus for 30 years in the Division of Police at every rank. And I'm married to my wife, who's here tonight and joined us for the last 28 years. We've been married. My daughter, Cassandra, who's 16 years old and is an avid horse rider. And I also have 2 adult daughters. One is 23 years old, and she graduated from Ohio State University and works with a real estate development company here in Columbus. And the other daughter, my oldest, is 26, and she is a graduate of Mount Carmel Nursing and is a NICU nurse here in Columbus. So it's a little bit about my family and my background. I've had the good fortune of working in every part of the organization and under all the previous chiefs. I see Chief Gamble here tonight and others. I've had good fortune to have mentors along the way and really experience all corners of the Division of Police. And that has helped me build relationships. Relationships are what has really helped drive where we can make change. It takes relationships. So to make that difference, I want to tell you just a little bit about when I took over as interim chief, how we made change using relationships and made a difference. I spent a lot of time with countless residents, too many to name, but I also spent time with some of the city leaders. Nana Watson here tonight from the NAACP president, and our faith community. We have a lot of people in the audience I've talked to tonight that make up our faith community, but certainly John Coates and Pastor Lamar and Reverend Joel King's here, and many others, Darnell Muhammad. So I've worked with people, Elder Larry Price, a lot of people in the community to get vision, to find out what their parishioners are telling them in the community they want. And then we use that approach to decide we need to have a community-focused, service-driven division. And I brought the executive staff team together, and in that room we had everyone from 20 years to 40 years of experience. So collectively, using all that experience, we were able to develop a plan to move forward to actually involve change, innovation, and excellence. And we made some hard decisions. One of the first that's most notable on everyone's mind is the disbanding the vice unit. We were willing to make those hard choices, which go along with our new mission statement. That was the very first thing we did. We changed our mission and our core values. We changed the mission to the men and women of the Division of Police, serve our community, guided by our core values of integrity, compassion, accountability, respect, and excellence, which spells an acronym for I CARE. We took this new organizational philosophy and developed structures that focused on accountability, focused on compassion, service, and relationships. We created in the chief's office an FBI Public Corruption Task Force to address officers that needed to be addressed through a criminal investigation versus an administrative investigation. We develop watch commanders. I have some of them here tonight that speak for the chief of police 24 hours a day when we're not out. So there's always somebody ultimately in charge in the division. We created public accountability subdivisions. One of the things that we did that was probably one of the most popular was create a therapy dog unit. Again, service and relationships with the community. One thing we did that we've never had before is we created a community services subdivision. Community services subdivision, there are three things that drive crime, a lot of the crime in Columbus, a lot that we hear about habitually, and it's mental health, poverty, and addiction. Police is not going to solve any one of those alone. It's going to take partnerships, community services, the health community, the faith-based community, Salvation Army. There's so many people we can bring in to address those. We've created youth services and victim services. To replace the vice unit, we created a packed unit, police and community together. And we bring all those resources in with the courts and with probation and with addiction counselors and housing and find ways to change people's reality that they have to deal with. So the mayor always has three top priorities for the city. If you ever listen to him, I'm sure you've heard these: neighborhoods, neighborhoods, and neighborhoods. So our PAC team is designed to focus on neighborhoods. We also are working hard on diversity hiring and building diversity through the ranks. What we've done through our changes and innovations is we've created, I was one of 3 or 4 people as the architect of the 10-year strategic diversity recruiting plan. I was on a team with the Harvard Bloomberg City Leadership Initiative that worked on diversity. And we've also created a paid public cadet pipeline program for increase our diversity. And we're building plans to build that diversity through the ranks. So we have new initiatives. A lot of new initiatives are on the horizon. I've kind of outlined what we've done so far, but I'm telling you now what we're going to do. We're going to look at technology and how we can use technology as a force multiplier. Look at more modern stuff like cloud-based technology and free officers up so they have proactive time to get out of their car, be in your neighborhood, and build those relationships at the officer level. And we're going to look at neighborhood coordination officers. Commissioner James O'Neill from NYPD had talked to me about this, and it works very well there. It's an idea where neighborhoods have unique interests for their particular block. We have a way of meeting that need by finding out what that neighborhood needs and taking that approach from all the services we can bring and muster from all the different groups to address that problem. But another neighborhood on another part of town may have a totally different need. It may be prostitution in one area, homeless in another area, aggressive panhandling. It could be an aggressive carry out to selling to minors. There's nuisance abatement stuff. There's so many things that we can do in that program. So those are some of the initiatives that we have on our horizon. So back to Commissioner Ramsey's question. Do you want the job or do you want to do the job? I've been doing the job for 286 days. We have made tremendous progress. We've changed fundamentally the culture and the vision of where we're going as a division of police. We've built on existing partnerships. We've expanded relationships. We have focused on a youth services programs, having a youth police advisory committee called YPAC, a juvenile police-initiated juvenile diversion program. We've really worked hard to build programs with COSI and Mobile Clue, and which is a partnership with the Police Foundation and COSI, which we're going to actually develop our relationships engagement with youth, the TAPS program that had graduation today, the Teen and Police Service Academy. So we want to make our neighborhoods safer, as do you. Given the opportunity, I will continue to do the job for the people of the city of Columbus. Thank you.
Thank you to both candidates for their opening statements. As I mentioned, we will now move into questions and answers. I said earlier we got over 100 online, and I've got a big stack here from the audience, so we are going to get through as many as we can, but obviously due to the volume, we won't get to all of them. But we noticed in the online submissions that there were a lot of themes. Many of you have the same kinds of questions on your mind, so even if you don't hear the exact words that you submitted, hopefully you will get the answers that you are seeking. I shared that the candidates have not received these questions in advance, and we will not time them for their responses, but we ask that you be thorough and concise so we can get through as many as possible, and we will alternate who answers first. Let me start with a question about crisis. One of the things I mentioned in my opening statement is that we heard from the community that they want someone who is proven in times of crisis. And so my first question will be for Mr. Quinlan. What is a crisis that you have led the department through, the division through, and what were the results?
Sorry. We have had many crises in the department over 30 years of work. There are times where we've had riots on campus, and we've had an active shooter or terrorist threat on campus that I responded to. We've had officers involved in uses of force that were outside of policy. We've had officers who were criminally charged. There have been a number of crises that we have responded to as a division, and as a leader of the division, there are things that we must focus on, and that's again being the 6 pillars of 21st century policing talk about building trust and transparency. How I responded to it was being transparent with the community, getting out in front of it and speaking about what occurred, what we know, sharing video when available and authorized for release, and making sure the public has an availability to ask a question or challenge an outcome to find out if there's something else we need to be doing. And so there's an example of the crisis management.
Thank you. And Mr. Tarrant, I meant to ask you earlier, am I pronouncing your last name correctly? Okay, thank you. Mr. Tarrant, the same question for you. A crisis that you've led your department through, and what were the results?
The crisis that I was involved in leading the department through was that the Department of Justice came into the city of Seattle and issued a consent decree. That required a wholesale change within that organization to change its behavior as it relates to patterns and practice. My responsibility going into that organization was to assist in restructuring the bureau I had responsibility for, so it was more responsive, more accountable, but more importantly, more focused on community. The crisis in and of itself occurred well before I got into the city, but the response was the plan that was built out to move that department forward. I've been called on in a number of communities to respond to crises where African Americans had been shot by white officers. A lot of those requests came either from members of Congress or from President Obama's White House. I had the opportunity to lead a team of professionals into Charlotte, North Carolina after an often-involved shooting there. The interaction there was to mitigate the level of violence, resistance, and protest, but more importantly, focused on getting the police department to open up to that community and work on a solution.
Thank you. Our next question I'm going to take from the audience. The Division of Police faces many challenges. What do you see as the top 3 challenges facing the division in 2020, and how do you plan on addressing these challenges on day 1 as chief? And we'll start with Mr. Tarrant.
Thank you. From my observations, and a lot of that is largely based on the Matrix report, I saw a lot of similarities to what occurred in the city of Seattle. The city of Seattle DOJ consent decree listed out 153 areas of deficiency and or requiring attention, very similar to what I saw in the Matrix report as it relates to the division of police here. So the priorities, in my opinion, are to be inclusive, to build community and diversity into the structure of the organization, and to build an operational strategy which includes procedural justice and constitutional policing. The second priority is restructuring. When I say restructuring, I'm talking about looking at how the organization is built, how it's currently structured, and how to put more of the existing officers in your neighborhoods. How that occurs is, you heard about the vice unit being disbanded, but there are a number of other areas where there are personnel savings that can be reapplied or redistributed in other areas. The other part of that structure requires professional development. So that's restructuring and professional development. It's hard to talk about diversity in an organization when it's not stratified throughout that entire organization. So you have to look at the processes internally which either impede or harm the ability for vertical movement in an organization. The last piece and the third priority would be training. And I talk about training in the capacity on how to interact with the community, training in the capacity on how the division becomes culturally competent. Okay. Thank you. There's a lot of history and a lot of trauma in this community just from the conversations that I've had with the folks since I've been here. And I've been here a few times now into this community. And so that's that last piece, is to bring the community into training, bring professionals into the training so that the training mirrors the services that the community wants.
Thank you. Same question for Mr. Quinlan. The Division of Police faces many challenges. What do you see as the top 3 challenges facing the division in 2020, and how do you plan on addressing these challenges on day 1 as chief?
Thank you very much. As the chief, you have to actually care about everything that's going on. We have people that are highly competent in the organization that can focus on individual projects. As the chief, you have to look at things more from a futuristic standpoint. What's on the horizon? What's coming that we have to prepare for now to be able to budget for, so we have the right equipment, that we have the right people in place in the future as things evolve. We're going to see autonomous vehicles, facial recognition, drones. There's so many things that are coming in the future. We have to be able to focus on that. So technology is one of them, and how we can use that as a force multiplier, as I said in my opening, by giving officers time in the areas they work, the neighborhoods they work, to do proactive policing by having a streamlined records management system, CAD, criminal case management, and early intervention system for officers. So we need to focus, as a chief, a priority on that, and that's going to take that planning on what we're going to need to budget for and staff for and train for in the future. The next thing is, we're having a lot of tragedy in our community, from youth violence and gun violence. We need to get a handle on what's occurring, and when people are victims of gun violence and then don't talk to the police, there's a concern about trust and legitimacy. So it goes back to the 6 pillars of 21st century policing, building trust and legitimacy, so people will talk to the police and share what they know, and that's how we need to focus on building those relationships and creating those connections. So youth and gun violence is certainly a concern to keep people safe. And the other thing is diversity hiring and diversity through the ranks. I agree with Perry. If we need people from the outside to come in and train that are from within the community, so we have the community perspective and we understand. Again, I'm partnering with the Anti-Defamation League to bring implicit bias training in. It's an 8-hour course, but we already have community members who come in. We need to build on that so there's an increased understanding and appreciation for the neighborhoods that officers police in, and we can hire more officers that are diverse and more reflective of the communities we represent and serve.
This next question is from an audience card submitted this evening, but it was also submitted by several people online. The Mayor's Safety Advisory Commission recommended an independent citizen review body be instituted. What is your opinion of this recommendation and why? And Sheriff Baldwin, in the spirit of being an advisory committee member, has shared that the flowers are blocking you, so I'm going to come remove those. I told you our advisory committee members worked hard. All right, so again, the Mayor's Safety Advisory Commission recommended an independent citizen review body be instituted. What is your opinion of this recommendation and why? And we'll start with Mr. Quinlan.
Thank you. I've had the good fortune over the past year or so to actually attend the majority of the Mayor's Community Safety Advisory Commission meetings and understand where some of the recommendations that are coming forward from them originated and what the thought is behind them. So I have a deeper understanding of why they've identified this as a need. And I certainly think, again, as I said, everything comes down to what the details are. If we're looking at a review, the question is, are we asking people review investigations already completed? Are we asking people to review the investigation and make a decision on the outcome? Are we asking citizens to actually be involved in the actual investigative process? So there's a lot of details that would need worked out in that. And I think there's a combination of those three approaches that we certainly can implement and look to benefit the division to bring the community perspective. One of the things I talked to President of the Urban League today, Stephanie Hightower, and one of the things I mentioned to her I want to do is ask the mayor and each council member to appoint someone to a Chiefs Advisory Commission or just advisory board that can actually meet with me on a regular basis. So they're their picks, not mine. They're leaders in the community that can bring forward what the community's concerns are. They can look at the investigations that are done. They have free access to the investigations. We can dissect them and decide what we need to do as far as making improvements in the methods we use. Maybe at my level, policies I can change. Again, one thing to keep in mind, though, is we have a collective bargaining agreement, and there is as troubling, as frustrating as that can be sometimes, I have to respect that because, and I'll tell you why. If I'm going to ask officers to go out there and respect a person, constitutional rights, and not try to get the outcome they want and expect a respect due process, then I have to respect due process. For them, it's modeling the behavior you want. If I try to circumvent that and just get the outcome I want, then I'm telling them it's okay for them to do that when they're engaged with public, and that's not acceptable. So we're going to find a way to make citizens more involved, have a greater voice in the process, and do it within our confines of how we conduct investigations and what we do as far as discipline when officers do make mistakes. Basically, if we mess up, we're going to fess up and clean up, and that's the bottom line.
Yes. The Mayor Safety Advisory Commission recommended an independent citizen review body be instituted. What is your opinion of this recommendation and why?
Yes. Let me expound on that. Twofold. I believe in the advisory capacity, which is on the front end, and that's where policy is developed and training should come from policy. The review piece is on the back end. You want to be able to look at things after they happen and see if you need to go back and change the front end. So, yes.
Thank you. I'm going to now pose two questions because they're similar, and they are from Travis and Izzy from the Beatty Community Center. They ask, what will you as chief do for not only our city, but in particular our neighborhood to keep youth safe? And secondly, how would you get youth involved in effective policing? How will you keep youth safe, and how would you get youth involved in effective policing? Great questions from our young people, and we'll start with Mr. Tarrant.
How do you keep youth safe? I'm gonna go back to my fallback, my standard, and that is the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE. NOBLE has been doing the Law in Your Community program for years, way back when I started the organization. It is a program that has a real talk conversation with youth in every community. What this program does is sets the stage for a constitutional conversation about what your rights are, but more importantly, when to demand your rights. 3 o'clock in the morning on the side of the road is not the time to demand your rights. That's when people get hurt. But more importantly, the follow-up to that is demand your rights. And that's part of that program. So that's the first piece. There are a number of other programs around how to keep youth safe. And I agree with what Chief Quinlan's talked about, and that is you have to focus on gun crimes and pulling guns out of communities. There's got to be some definitive education. Thank you. There's got to be some definitive education and proactivity in keeping guns out of the hands of youth. The third piece of that is you have to do something to fill that idle time. Bad things happen when you have idle youth. In my experience traveling around the country, working with a number of different departments, and part of the testimony that I put before the Task Force on 21st Century Policing was in that vein. And I will tell you, in working with Ron Davis and the COPS office, when we were talking about school safety, is come up with alternatives to suspension so you're not kicking kids out of school. But finding something for them to do. One of the programs that I'm proud to say I'm on the board of this organization and do interact with that organization regularly in Seattle is a program called Choose 180. And what that program does is a community-based program that goes into schools and takes responsibility for those youth who otherwise would be suspended and puts some program around that about how to change behavior and their environment, their friends, as if it were. So that's another another way of keeping them safe.
Thank you. Mr. Quinlan. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. I'm trying to get through all these questions y'all keep giving me. How would you get youth involved in effective policing? Mentoring.
I will tell you again, there's one program the Urban League has, their Young Professionals program. Boys and Girls Club also have programs that will allow police officers to connect to youth and youth to connect to the police. One of the programs we did on the West Coast in the Los Angeles area was a program called 50-50, where we took 50 kids, 50 cops, put them right in front of each other, and just had them have a conversation. That did lead to some of those folks becoming cops.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Quinlan.
Thank you. Okay, on youth safety, again, it's so important that we create those relationships and connections. It's hard to ask, and this kind of touches on the policing piece too, it's hard to ask parents and brothers and sisters to trust their family members to us if they don't have that trust and legitimacy in policing in the community. So we do many things here to work with youth, and one of them is we have Citizens Police Academy, and what I'd like to start, and I mentioned it just a little bit earlier in the introduction, is a YPAC, a Youth Police Advisory Commission, where they actually sit down, 30 teens will actually sit down with the chief and explain what is happening in the community from their perspective, so I can shape policy and practices and training and community organizers around that. We have a TAPS program, Teen and Police Service Academy, where we take some of the most at-risk youth that still have a future when we bring police officers in and sit down with them on day one. They typically don't want to speak with us. We've been right here in this auditorium. They don't want to interact. By the end of 11 weeks, they're fist bumping, high fiving, hugging, crying, both officers and the youth. What happens is they see beyond that uniform. They don't see the person in that uniform. They see James, and they know the person by name, and that establishes that relationship. So then when they meet people on the street, officers on the street, they know that they're approachable. And we have a pre-cadet program we're designing with the Columbus Public Schools and the downtown school system to be a feeder for a paid cadet program, which is a pipeline to hiring officers. So I'm kind of covering both questions together here. The other thing is I'm starting that youth services program where before all we did was truancy and go in and lock teens up because they're not in school. Now we've changed it to a youth service program where we're positively engaging youth and have an interaction with them, not just during the school day, but also started the program on after school. So they have safe routes home from school. They have officers who can have time to go to Boys and Girls Clubs and the rec centers and different community areas where teens congregate. We're looking at, with a partnership with the Police Foundation and COSI, building a mobile CLUE. It's a STEM-based training plan that stands for Learning, Understanding, and Education, Center for Learning, Understanding, and Education. And we're going to use that process, again, to put youth service officers with their teens so they have those relationships, they've built those connections, and they find police officers approachable. And these are going to start in the middle schools and the elementary schools. It's very difficult to walk into East High School auditorium and sit down and say, we're the police, we're here, what can we do for you? The relationship's not there. We're taking those down into the earlier ages and grades and working and developing that relationship throughout the school system and throughout the community, so when we do come in to East High School auditorium and sit here, they already recognize people in the audience that they know that are police officers, and they'll talk to them. And we don't have that barrier to overcome. So we also did it's about 4 weeks into the program, a police initiative, I mentioned this before, a police-initiated juvenile diversion program. As Perry said, instead of just suspending kids or locking kids up, let's find a better way to engage them and find an outcome where they don't have a criminal charge hanging over their head, and we can find a way to get the courts involved and get the same outcome as far as community service and remediation without the criminal charge that's going to follow them around. So we have many opportunities to both engage the safety of our youth and use that as pipelines for hiring youth in the police department when they become 21.
Thank you. We'll move to our next question. Please describe your experience working with police unions and collective bargaining. And we'll start with Mr. Quinlan.
How do I do? We got one of our union leaders down here. Again, it's everything centers on the same theme, it's relationships. I have worked with these individuals for 30 years. Many of the people that are in the FOP are good, well-intentioned police officers who represent the labor side of the employee relationship. I represent and stand for the management side. But when we come together and sit down and we want to start a therapy dog program and handpick certain officers, and we want to start a PAC program where we can bring 60-day temp officers in from their normal assignment to stand up operations, go in and operation, do something, and then put those people back on patrol and then bring someone else in. When all these different programs that we're trying to stand up through a mid-contract cycle, it takes a relationship. When I sit down with people at the union, again, these are people that I've worked with over 30 years where I've been on the street where I've trusted my life to these individuals, and they put their life in my hands. And the relationship's powerful and strong, and we can get a lot done, not because we agree on the labor side or management side, but because we have mutual respect for each other, and we are willing to hear someone out and find where can we start with common ground and build from that position. And that takes a long time to be able to build that because, quite frankly, the union in Ohio policing at least is, in our current FOP, Lodge 9, is very strong. The agreement we have is very restrictive. We have about 1 page of management rights in the collective bargaining agreement, and the rest is other terms and conditions of employment. It's very strong, but we make progress and we get through these issues and we work through them. We met this Tuesday to sit down and go through a laundry list of items mid-bargaining and labor relations to get results that change how we police based on what your needs are and your expectations are. So I think we're very successful there.
Thank you. Mr. Tarrant?
My experience with bargaining units is across a couple of different organizations because I've worked with a couple of different organizations. So on the one side, while I was in Tucson, I was on that side bargaining for labor. So I've seen that side of the table. When I went to Seattle, the union sued to keep the chief from bringing me in. So that was my relationship with the union there initially. I say that because I understand they have a desire to protect. But the larger part of that is that the union has to be part of the solution. You can't bring folks to the table. You can't bring folks to the table and work on a solution and then have a sidebar. So it's imperative that the union is at that table. Now, I will go back to my relationships in Seattle. After that initial lawsuit, I have great relationships with all 5 or 7, I believe it's 7 different labor organizations within Seattle Police Department. The point on the management side is to ensure service delivery. I do not begrudge a labor organization for doing what it needs to do to protect its members. But there's also an obligation to get the work done. And that's the conversation that I've always felt and continue to feel needs to occur as it relates to labor. Now, I've never worked with the FOP here in Columbus, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation and building that working relationship. But again, it is about collectively the community, the organization, which includes labor, getting it done.
Thank you. The questions that were submitted online and even some this evening have race as a constant theme. So let's address the elephant in the room. How would you handle the documented issues that face women, female officers, and officers of color on the police force? for Mr. Tarrant first.
Racism and bias are real. Okay. They exist. Whether it's inside the police department or outside, you have to sit down and talk about history and the trauma. Because there's trauma if you're talking about gender issues, and there's trauma if you're talking about racial issues. You have to have that conversation before you can move forward. And that's, and that's where it exists. So how do you do that? And how do you get past that? It's about inclusion. I talked about transparency, inclusion, and accountability with the community. That absolutely has to exist internally within the organization. You can't say you're building an organization that's responsive and professional if it's not being reflected internally. You have an obligation to be fair and just inside and outside. And I'll give you an example. A very large federal law enforcement organization asked me, how do they go about diversifying their workforce? When I walked into the leadership suite, there was the only minority representation was the receptionist sitting at the front desk. It's pretty challenging to me to talk about what you're doing outside if it doesn't look that way inside.
Mr. Quinlan.
Thank you. I agree. Race and bias in police agencies is troubling, problematic, and a reality. What we have to do is create opportunities. We have to have a very clear, unambiguous, no tolerance, no exceptions, and swift and certain penalties for anyone who violates that. We have now started a program in the division where we've moved investigations that are related to EEO matters to the director's level. And we're seeing already results and more people coming forward to report their concerns, their experiences, and what kind of solutions and how we can address those. So it has to be very clear from the top down, from every corner of the agency has to make it clear that there is no room for any bias, whether it's race, gender, or any other type of bias, no matter what it is, in an organization. People should feel free to come in to a work environment and have a safe, secure, welcoming place to work. That transfers over to how people are treated in the public. So we need, again, build the relationships to bring more people in, to expand the recruiting efforts that we have currently to be inclusive and make our representation on the division more reflective of the community. We've made progress. We had 15 to 20% diversity in our recruit classes. We're now getting to 30 and 35%. So we're seeing progress. But we also have to solve the problem of diversity representation through the ranks. So people are more in a leadership role. People are more trainers that are diverse, more supervisors, more sergeants, more FTOs that are diverse, so they can bring new perspectives and experiences to the workplace, and we can improve how we interact and how we provide service to the public and how we treat employees.
Thank you. And let's stay on that theme and get a little more specific. Columbus is a diverse community with residents from many different racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and religious backgrounds. We have a significant LGBTQ, New Americans, immigrant, and refugee populations. Please share a specific experience when you needed to build trust and improve relationships with an underrepresented community. What was the outcome, and is there anything you would have done differently? Mr. Quinlan.
Thank you. I hope people don't mind me calling them out by name. I saw Napoleon Bell here, so that's the first. Sorry, that's the first thing that comes to mind on an experience. The two of us went out on many Sundays throughout the city, especially in the New American community and in the Latino community. And we took translators with us. And we presented on Sundays after church. We did one night, we did a volleyball. They were playing volleyball in the backyard, and we sat at the tables, picnic tables by the volleyball court, and presented what we call the ABCs of policing, and talked about how police work, why we do what we do, and how it's perceived by that culture. So we know how we might be able to train our officers to improve their de-escalation skills, their understanding, their conversational skills, and have better outcomes. So of all the times Napoleon Bell and I went out and met with New Americans and Latino community specifically as one example, and there were many times we did that. It was most weekends we were going out, interacting with those communities. We brought fire department with us, and they would present on, especially in the Somali community, when fire comes out, what to do when a medic wants to treat a person in the community, and that they're not taking them away to the hospital and not going to see them again. We would work with them on that. We would work with them on traffic stops. We'd work with them on what to do, just interacting with the police in general. So, and again, we brought translators with us. We worked with the elders in the community. That was very positive. We received a lot of goodwill for our officers and our officers towards the community based on all those times we went out and spent a Sunday afternoon with people in the community.
Thank you. Mr. Tarrant?
I'm going to give you two examples, one from very early on in my law enforcement career and another one more contemporarily. When I first started doing policing and joined the Tucson Police Department, one of my first assignments was into a neighborhood that was historically disconnected and I'll say didn't have the best reputation or best relationship with the police department. So I was assigned to this neighborhood, where English was a second language. The primary language spoken in that neighborhood was Spanish. I went to high school in Canada where French is required, so there was a little bit of a connection. So in order to be effective and relate to that community, I learned Spanish. And so that's one of those mechanisms for engaging communities and building those relationships. More contemporarily, in Seattle. Seattle is a fairly diverse city. Last count, somewhere between 119 and 128 different languages are spoken. Pretty diverse community. A very large refugee and immigrant community. Because we wanted to build relationships, one of the things we did was went out to those communities where we were having particular difficulty with relationships. And what we ultimately ended up doing was asking those communities to identify folks that we could hire, bring internal to the organization to help us translate materials and build relationships, which ultimately led to several different invitations and more importantly, being invited to different mosques. There are two things in addition to respect that all cultures have in common. I'm sorry, respect and humility. The other two things that break down barriers between communities is music and food. So when you have an opportunity to celebrate Ramadan with a family, a community, and a mosque, you get to sit down and enjoy some really good food, some really good culture, and really good conversation, which builds relationships.
Thank you. So Police Chief has many, many different stakeholder groups, and that also includes our 1,900 officers. Share your thoughts about how you will ensure officers have what they need to do their jobs, whether it's health and wellness, training, technology, equipment. What is your plan of action for that? Mr. Tarrant?
The sixth pillar of 21st century policing is health and wellness. One of the things that we did internally to the Tucson Police Department was we actually hired a clinical psychologist that did evaluations not only on folks that we were hiring in that process, but they were immediately available to make assessments upon request because they were internal, we could call them out. And then the second part of that was they were available in case anybody needed to talk to a mental health professional without involving the formal structure of the organization. And in addition to that, there's an opportunity to build on a peer support program which we had, and that was actually training officers throughout the organization to recognize signs and symptoms of issues that would help them redirect somebody to services as opposed to waiting until things go horribly wrong. Okay. The technology piece. Had the opportunity as part of a internship program to work with a group of young folks who were learning and building their skills in computer coding. What we did was we had them ride with officers on a particular problem around the contacts that we were having with folks who were having emotional and or mental health crises. What ultimately that group of youth did was build an app that's on every smartphone of every officer in Seattle, which gives that officer the ability to engage in de-escalation immediately with somebody who's involved in that episode. It gives the officers what we call hooks and triggers. So hooks are things you want to say to a person to get compliance, and triggers are words and phrases and things you want to stay away from that are likely to cause that person to escalate. That's on every phone. That's on every phone that every officer carries. There are a number of other technology pieces out there. I currently chair Noble's Technology Committee. I also chair a technology committee for Department of Homeland Security. The responsibility in that capacity is not only looking at technology that exists, but looking at future technologies and technology gaps, but more importantly, making sure that the technology being adopted by law enforcement will not have a negative impact on the people we serve.
Thank you. Mr. Quinlan?
Thank you very much. This has been a very important component of the changes we've made in the division. We've created a wellness bureau. We've never had one before, actually at a bureau level. We put that much emphasis on it. So we have a wellness bureau now because, as I explained in the supplemental questions I was asked to present, about if an officer kind of goes back to the idea on a airplane. Everybody who's ridden on an airplane knows that they always tell you put your oxygen mask on first before you try to help someone else. The idea is you're not any good to someone else if you're not well yourself. So from an officer wellness piece, we have so many different redundancies built in to where we have peer assistance teams, we have a chaplains program, we have mobile crisis response teams that are available. We have a very robust CIT program that we use that are all available. We have an officer support team. We have division psychologists when an officer is involved in a tragic police-involved shooting. What we have done in the past is require them to go see the division psychologist within 3 days before they can return to work. I've changed that now to where not only do they have to go at 3 days, they have to do 3 months and 6 months down the road, so they have follow-up. And thank you, and I'll tell you why that's so important. Officers see virtually a mass shooting over maybe a slow drip, but over a period of a career, they've seen 50, 100 shootings that have to have some type of impact. And then when they're involved in a traumatic event themselves, the 3 days afterwards, they may be numb enough that, yeah, I'm fine, I'm ready to go back to work. But what happens 3 months later, 6 months later, they're getting around time to go to the grand jury, they're not sleeping, they're grinding their teeth, they're isolated from their friends because they don't want to talk about the event because they're not supposed to. So we have a follow-up now that's mandatory for officers to attend the psychologist, a professional person that can provide that training. And again, through the peer assistance, through the therapy dog program we have, these are all wellness programs for officers. The technology piece is something I've already taken aggressive steps to address. I have at least 3 different vendors right now trying to compete to get a future contract to bring new technologies here between our records management system and our CAD system. Right now, they're 2 separate vendors. They don't talk, and they create all this redundancy and time away from work. This is going to streamline that. It also needs to have a criminal case management and an early intervention system. So what happens when an officer's been on 3 suicides in the last month? Is there anything letting a supervisor know, hey, you might just want to check on this officer. They've been on 3 suicides, 2 car fatal crashes, and a homicide. You might want to check in. And they've also changed addresses twice in the last 6 months. What's going on with the officer? May check in and make sure they're well. And officer suicide in New York City has gone from an average of 5 a year to 12 just this year. And we've seen things here with suicide as well that are tragic. We want to make sure officers are well. We want to bring technologies in that make them more efficient. And we want to reduce the redundancies between the officers that create frustration, cause problems with evidence in court, and slow the entire process down by streamlining, having everything interconnected, having our property and our evidence going over to the forensic side so there's no chain of custody issues. Those are all things that new technologies will fix in a cloud-based system. Right now, we're using last decade's technology, and whatever we get today is going to be outdated in 6 months. So we have to have the most recent and up-to-date technologies to do the job so we can provide the service to you that you expect and demand.
Thank you. Our time is winding down very quickly. There were many, many questions that we weren't able to get to. I apologize we weren't able to get through them all, but I hope you did get a good sense of what each candidate proposes to bring to our community. I have a closing question for each candidate, and then they will have 2 minutes to give their closing statement, and then I will conclude with our next steps. So, Mr. Quinlan, some say our next chief needs to come with a fresh new perspective, which can only come from outside of the division. What is your response to this?
For those of you who say that, I absolutely respect your interest in that, and I want the best for the city of Columbus just like you do. When I tried to decide for myself why should we go with an internal candidate versus an external that can bring new ideas, one, I thought back to the relationships that it takes to get good ideas and get innovations, to get change, to get excellence into the police department. And then the other thing I thought of is all the progress we've made over the last 286 days. All the changes we've made, all the systemic improvements we've done, the cultural changes, the policy changes, the training ideas, the engagement changes. So the way I had to visualize it to myself to try to figure out how to explain to me why the best person is to stay within the division. And so if you'll indulge me and kind of visualize the same thing I did, I thought about a train speeding down the tracks. And I'm the conductor of the train currently. So we have this train going down the tracks at full speed. I'm in the engine compartment as the conductor, and we're really having safe travels, and things are are really changing and making progress. Our journey's going well. But make no mistake about it, there are still curves ahead to navigate, mountains to climb, intersections to cross, and loads to be balanced. Taking the person out of the engine compartment and changing conductors while it's at full speed can bring with it concerns and problems and unintended consequences. So what I ask is that you wait till the train reaches the station, comes to a full stop, and is safe to change conductors. Thank you.
Mr. Tarrant, some say our next chief should come from outside. No, I'm sorry, some say our next chief should come from within the division because they already know our community. What is your response to this?
While it may be valid that somebody internal to the organization may know the community, but do they know the community? And I say that in the sense of being able to come in and build relationships. Where I'm coming from with that comment is, if you know the community, you may not approach certain parts of that community. You may overlook building relationships with that community. The other part of that is that with an external perspective, and this has been my experience going into Seattle and then looking at other departments, to include Ferguson, Missouri, and I will point out the chief who followed in Ferguson with all the issues that occurred there, who's sitting over off of the left side here, or my left side. He'll tell you that going into a community from the outside is that you can see a lot of things that have become blind spots for people who are internal to the organization.
Thank you. And now for your final closing statements. You have 2 minutes. And since Mr. Tarrant started in the beginning, we will close with Mr. Quinlan, and you will be timed for your 2 minutes.
Thank you. On January 10th, I presented Mayor Ginther with an Opportunity Columbus plan, which is included here. It involved change, innovations, and excellence in community policing. The plan incorporated the 6 pillars of 21st century policing. Kristen Armstrong, an Olympic gold medalist, said this about opportunity. Times of transition are strenuous, but I love them. They are an opportunity to purge, rethink priorities, and be intentional about new habits. We can make our new normal any way we want. We have an opportunity. We have an opportunity, Columbus, to prioritize. We have an opportunity to grow. We have an opportunity to create new horizons on policing in our community. And we've shown that willingness to change over the last 9 months as we've changed policing in our neighborhoods. So why continue doing the job? For me, I offer 30 years of service to the city of Columbus, building relationships and leading change. Last month, I became a grandfather when my oldest daughter adopted her foster son. And I want to be your chief to ensure every child and every grandchild in our community grows up in a safe neighborhood. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you, Mr. Quinlan. Mr. Tarrant, your closing statement.
Thank you. It's true, a lot of you are only seeing me for the first time tonight. It's also true that we haven't built a relationship yet. And I said yet. It's true that I'm new to Columbus. But what's not true is going to the outside won't work, because it is true, it will work, and it has worked. I have a wealth of experience, not from working within one organization, but from working within multiple organizations. From leading a national organization across 2 presidential administrations and working in those capacities, providing law enforcement advice on criminal justice reform, gun law reform, to both the White House as well as Congress. As a subject matter expert on police tactics, I've been reached out and requested to review pretty much every one of the shootings that you've heard about over the last 5 years involving African Americans, whether the request came from the community, from members of the Congress, or the White House. My approach in every one of those has been to bring my academic background, my police experience, having worked in operational units, and more importantly, my networks of folks to bear on issues and problems. What you will get from me is my commitment to be here, to be part of this community, and build a relationship that leads to change. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking both of our candidates. Let me offer a final word of thanks to each of you, not only for being here tonight, but for being engaged throughout this entire process. I want to also thank my city colleagues who have been a tremendous support throughout this process. You are too numerous to name, but I am grateful to City Council, the City Attorney's Office, and the Departments of Neighborhood, Civil Service, Human Resources, Finance, Public Safety, and Technology. And a particular debt of gratitude to the team, the entire team in the mayor's office, in particular Doug Murray, Denise Bauer, Mel Crable, Robin Davis, and John Tolbert. Oh, thank you. Thank you. In closing, throughout this process, I've been reminded of my favorite African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Mayor Ginther could have quietly selected our next police chief behind closed doors, but he decided we were better as a community by going together. Thank you for going on this important journey with us. Have a safe evening.